This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh as we turn to Bolivia, where protests and blockades have shut down much of the country over the last 11 days. Unions and indigenous groups launched a general strike August 3rd to condemn Bolivia's right-wing interim president, Jeanine Áñez, for repeatedly postponing the country's presidential election. Áñez said the election delays are needed due to the COVID-19 outbreak, but her opponents say she's using the pandemic to strengthen her presidential campaign and to crack down on critics. Áñez took power in November following a coup that ousted former President Evo Morales, the country's first indigenous leader. Áñez has called indigenous politicians savages and has vowed to bring the Bible back to Bolivia. On Monday, the Bolivian government deployed the military as the road blockade shut off access to La Paz and other cities. Pro-government paramilitary forces have also attacked the protesters. Organizers of the general strike are calling for the new elections to take place on September 6th.
We will not allow this de facto government to embezzle our plurinational state of Bolivia. In this council, we determined we will carry on with the protest until the September 6 elections are ratified.
Other protesters accuse the coup Bolivian government of using the COVID-19 pandemic to consolidate power.
The Bolivian people of El Alto are demanding the resignation of Jeanine Áñez and her lazy ministers. They are just using this moment to loot our country in the name of health.
The United States has come out in support of Bolivia's coup government, claiming the ongoing blockade and general strike, quote, threaten democracy. Following last year's coup, Bolivia experienced one of the deadliest and most repressive periods in decades as the government carried out summary executions and arbitrary detentions. The violence is detailed in a new report by Harvard's International Human Rights Clinic and the University Network for Human Rights. James Cavallero, the former president of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, said these abuses mirror the authoritarian behavior of the dictatorships of the 1970s in the Americas. This must stop, he said. We go now to Cochabamba, Bolivia, where we're joined by Ali Vargas, journalist with Calsachan News. You've been on the streets every day, Ali. Can you describe what's happening there and just who this coup president Áñez is, who recently tested positive also for COVID-19?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. That's right. We're on day 11 now of the general strike that was called by the National Workers' Federation, but also by the indigenous groups across most rural areas of the country. And almost all of the key highways in the country have roadblocks. People put stones, erecting barricades across all of these, bringing the country to a standstill. As I said, every single region, every department of the country is taking part in this strike, and it's shown the level, the mobilizing force of those who oppose the current coup government. And the movement was triggered by the suspension of elections, the fourth suspension in 3 months. But I think it's about a much wider anger that exists in society towards the government, towards the current president, Jeanine Áñez. I think for a long time, they've been in power now for 9 months. And in that time, Bolivia's gone from being the fastest growing economy in the region to an economic collapse that began before COVID-19. People feel impoverished. They feel persecuted. There's a climate of authoritarianism in the country, persecution against leftists, against media outlets such as our own. And people, I think the suspension of the elections was a trigger for the wider discontent there is to spill out. And that's why we're seeing a number of different demands as well within the movement, some calling for elections as soon as possible, Evo Morales' wing of the movement, and then more radical sections calling for the immediate sort of overthrow of the government. And I think the next couple of days will be key to seeing which section of the movement will win out.
Well, Ali Vargas, can you talk about how security forces have responded to the protesters, and in particular, the paramilitary groups that have reportedly been attacking them. Who are these paramilitary security forces, and since when and by whom have they been deployed?
The question of repression during this last period, I think, is an interesting question. Actually, the police and military haven't been mobilized very much. There's a lot of reports that police in some of the big cities have refused to be deployed. Those are unconfirmed reports. But we know that the current government isn't shy about bringing out the police and military when they want to. Just after the coup, they carried out 2 massacres of indigenous protesters who are protesting against the coup. And the fact that they haven't been able to mobilize the police and military, I think, is something worth commenting upon. Instead, what they've had to do is use these paramilitary groups, 2 in particular, one in the city of Santa Cruz in the east and another in the city of Cochabamba. In Cochabamba, they're called the Resistencia Juvenil Cochala, which is a group of mostly sort of ex-criminals, gang members who formed as a political group during the protests against Evo Morales in October. And they've been reactivated and remobilized, and they're armed. They have firearms, and they've gone to attack protests in the city of Cochabamba. One key point. In the city of Santa Cruz is a group called the Unión Juvenil Cruceñista, who are a much older group going back many decades, formed in a kind of traditionally sort of fascist model, religious sort of elements to it as well. And they were active in the 2008-2009 protests against Evo Morales, which WikiLeaks cables have since revealed were having money funneled to them by the US government via US aid. And these groups, again, have gone out to some of the smaller towns outside the city to attack protesters. In one town, Santa Rosa in Santa Cruz, 3 people were shot by this group. No deaths, but 3 people have been hospitalized with gunshot wounds. And the government itself have openly endorsed these groups. A couple of days ago, the Minister of Defense said that, this group in Santa Cruz, the Cruceñistas, they know what to do. They need to send a message to Bolivia. And the Interior Minister has a number of times publicly endorsed the group in Cochabamba, calling them, heroes who fight for democracy and this sort of thing. So they're mobilizing paramilitary groups to violently crush protests, but they haven't been able to do that on a national scale. They haven't been able to attack the strongest points of the protest, because these paramilitary groups are small at the same time.
I want to turn to the ousted president, Evo Morales, speaking to Al Jazeera in Mexico City last year after the coup.
There was a political, ideological, social, cultural, and financial liberation. And what they can't forgive is that I nationalized the natural resources.
No perdono al imperio norteamericano, el sistema capitalista, como un país, ¿no? Llamado de izquierda.
The North American empire doesn't forgive that a left-wing country, a socialist community, shows the world that there is a non-capitalist way of doing things with equality, dignity, and identity.
So can you tell us about this postponed election and what exactly Evo Morales is saying? And the coup president now, supported by the United States, Áñez, who's tested positive for COVID, calling indigenous people savages. She's saying she's bringing the Bible back to Bolivia, what this all means.
So the elections were supposed to be held on May the 3rd, which is already quite late. Remember, the so-called interim president took power in mid-November 2019. She was supposed to call elections within 3 months. That didn't happen. And eventually, they agreed on May the 3rd as a date. And that was supposed to be a sort of peaceful, democratic route out of the crisis, a democratic route out of the current government, which has never had a significant base of support and which was expected to lose the elections. That got postponed with the COVID-19 crisis. there was a disappointment among the people, but as general acceptance because of the way that the pandemic was developing at the time. So then the legislature, the elected legislature, where the MAS has a majority, said the election should be in August. That got suspended again, and finally September the 6th was agreed on as a date. All the parties signed up to it, including the Movement Towards Socialism. But then what we saw after that was it became very clear that Áñez's popularity was continuing to slide. The fact that people had lost, with the quarantine, the vast majority of people lost their jobs, lost their incomes, and received no support, no income support from the state. Instead, what you saw was the government taking out IMF loans, privatizing, paralyzing sort of big state projects that began under Evo Morales.
Ali, we just have 30 seconds, but I wanted to ask you about the Trump administration condemning the blockades in Bolivia, claiming the protesters are the ones disrupting the democratic process. If you can talk about what difference it makes, the U.S. position on Bolivia, very quickly.
Well, the U.S. needs to pressure the Bolivian government to take the peaceful democratic route out of this crisis, which is to accept elections as soon as possible, but without the persecution that they've been carrying out against the MAS, against leftist candidates. And if they can do that, then that is the only way that Bolivia can overcome this crisis in a peaceful way. The other option is a forcible overthrow of the government or a brutal state crackdown on the protests and the general strike.
Ali Vargas, we want to thank you for being with us. Journalist with Calzacha News, joining us from Cochabamba, Bolivia.